All right, everyone. Thanks for being back with us. We are continuing today through chapter 3. And chapter 3 is sometimes called the fall or the temptation. And we are picking up today in verse 4. Remember that the serpent has asked Eve, or the woman, a question. And his question was misleading and served to get her attention on the tree that they are not to take of. So this is his now response to her answer. But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Okay, so here we see how quickly the serpent has upped the temptation. From first drawing attention to the limitation, now he insinuates, actually fairly clearly states, that God has misled the woman. He's now essentially saying that God has told the woman something that isn't true. You won't die. For God knows when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. And now the serpent is introducing this idea of animosity, fear, jealousy, something between God and the woman. God doesn't want you. He knows that if you do that, you're going to get better. He doesn't want you. He's trying to hold you down. He's trying to keep you from this good thing. And so we read it fairly innocuously because we're familiar with it. But this is a serious accusation that the serpent has put out there rather kind of blandly. But if you really follow the logic here, he is saying very disturbing things to the woman about her trust and her ability to trust God.
Yeah, well, right. Let's not, push past the fact that in the first quote we have, or the first question rather, he, essentially asks a misleading throwaway kind of question. Did God say you couldn't eat from any tree? Which the obvious answer is no, that's not what God said. In this question, though, the serpent is actually insinuating that the serpent knows what God said better than even the woman does, right? This idea that, no, you've missed a fundamental aspect of what was said here, that God has misled you, that there's a knowledge of the intention of God that there's no way that this created creature could have. Yet, here we have this idea that ultimately, if you are to trust God, the one who created you, then you're going to not fulfill the full potential that you would like to have or that you would prefer to be able to acquire. And so we have this strange, though, somewhat remarkably quick transition away from just asking a question about what can and can't you do to a literal denial of the facts of the truth of the one who gave that information in the first place.
Yeah, and the language is important here. Knowing good and evil, that comes to be of importance later, but this idea that your eyes will be open. In other words, God has not told you the truth. God doesn't want you to see the truth. And the implication here, as Michael has alluded to, is that the serpent knows more about the real story than God. That the serpent is a trusted source of information and God is not. And it would be nice if there were some long drawn out temptation narrative. If we read that for days on end, Eve walked past the tree until she finally couldn't take it anymore. But the scripture's appraisal of human strength is pretty low. Yeah. And so we jump right to the next verse. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then both of their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Interesting here, we normally kind of read this very sequentially, that Eve ate first, that she goes and finds Adam, that she then almost fulfills the role of the serpent in their relationship, that she sort of tempts him. This story is told very simply, and I think cuts against those assumptions. He was with her, she took some, she gave some to him, and they ate. That's everything. We have made novels and pictures and theologies of women and men. We have shoved so many of our assumptions into this text that it's very hard to read it as simply as it is stated. She took some, she ate it, and she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. This is really less a case of a domino falling and hitting the next one than something they essentially do together. This is not the story of a woman who falls and then tricks a man. This is men and women disobeying God together. I don't think that there's a moral separation here that we sometimes have tried to read into this story.
I think it's a great caution. Actually, I was going to say that no story in the Bible probably has gotten as much airtime with comedians as this story, because there's a lot of gender jokes that get made here. There's a lot of, sort of oppositional kind of things that you can do with this text. But friends, the reality is here, and I think we actually, because this story is a hallmark of every children's Bible, I think we maybe make this a child's story, but this isn't a child's story. It actually is a substantial glimpse into the darkness of the human soul. You might not see it in my Bible here. Let me throw this up so that you can see it. This is verse 5 here. It says, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. You will be like God." This is critical. You see there's a comma there, knowing good and evil. So if you look this up in a critical commentary, what they're going to tell you is that the knowing good and evil here is hard to translate. That fundamentally, these words are jammed next to each other in the original language, which means that a possible interpretation of this is that when you say this knowing of good and evil, that it means that you will be knowing God, that you will be like God, that you will have that deified character of God, that you will have risen to the level that God is, that God's holding back from you the part of God's greatness that you could have if you partook of this. And if that's accurate, bear with me for just a second here. Think about the implication of this. That means that what's at stake here isn't just we want to be a little wiser. It's we want to rise up a level. We want to be called God's equal. We don't want there to be any difference between us than the one who made everything. And that is a huge grasp. I mean, ultimately, that's an impossible reach for the creation to try to reach to the level of creator. And that's exactly what's in play in this story.
I think a case could be made that inherent in all temptation is that idea to disobey what God has wanted for what we have, to fulfill the role of God for ourselves, to take the idea of ownership and directorship and initiative for ourselves rather than look to God for that. And so I think that is a perfectly acceptable way to read this text, that in taking of the fruit, in disobeying what God has said, particularly under the advice of the serpent who said, you will become godlike. This will elevate you. Eve and Adam are tempted because at the root of that is selfishness. It's pride, it's ego, it's self-desire, self-satisfaction. And it's no surprise that that's where the snake presses. That's the button that he tries to push. That is an inherent weakness in most of us. And so then there is, in the immediate aftermath of their eating, the eyes of both were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. The first thing that happens in the aftermath of the disobedience is a distancing from one another. They are no longer unashamed. Remember, it told us this in the early part of the story, that they were naked, but they were unashamed. Now they separate from one another visually. They cover themselves before one another. They no longer look upon each other without shame, without distance. There is something that has changed in their relationship, and the result is embarrassment. The result is covering, is not being able to see one another in fullness, not being willing to be seen in fullness. So the first thing that happens here is subtle, but it's important that they now, to some extent, as they will tomorrow from God, they to some extent now hide themselves from one another.
Yeah, make no mistake about it here that there is a play here between knowledge and open eyes, and there's a play between the crafty serpent who comes and the pursuit of wisdom. This is the narrative that they're telling themselves, right? That this tree is beautiful. The fruit is even, what's the exact word that we have here? The fruit is desirable.
A delight to the eye.
Oh, a delight to the eye? Right. So here, these are all positive frames that Eve has already told this story to herself, that this is going to be good, that this is an opportunity for me to take a step forward. We often do consider wisdom to be a positive step. We often do consider our eyes being opened and illumination to be a positive thing. It's not very often you hear that in the negative sense. Well, that's in play here, right? Because this is the narrative that Eve is telling herself. But the problem is that she's using that narrative to move herself out of her right relationship, both with Adam and as also with God. And she's moving into a new state where her eyes being opened actually creates for her an awareness of lack, of vulnerability, of spiritual jealousy, right? So she now inhabits a world in which she has to be aware of the literal division or separation between her and these other relationships that she, in her innocence, did not need to have. So wisdom is being redefined. It's not just this infinite quest moving forward to try to acquire knowledge and insight. It's actually wisdom under the guidance and purview of what God intended that we should value. If wisdom would have been following God's directive, Clint, but that's not what they reached for. They reached for their own kind of wisdom, and in doing so, they saw things that they weren't intended to see.
Yeah, this can be a struggle for us. We sometimes inherently think that knowing things is good, but there are things that probably each of us know that we wish we didn't, right? There are things that we've learned through hardship. There are things that we've learned about others that we wish we could unlearn. In fact, I recently listened to an interview with a man who had struggled with alcoholism, and he said exactly that. He said, I wish I could unlearn the things that I wish I didn't know. And there is that sense here that what Adam and Eve have now learned doesn't make them better. This is not knowledge that preserves. This is not knowledge that allows them to navigate their world better. This isn't knowledge that somehow makes them better people. They now know themselves as fallen. They now know themselves as separate. They now know themselves as naked. You know, imagine some of the things that as we grow our children unlearn, whether it's characters associated with major holidays or whatever that might be, right? There's a certain sadness in coming to know some things that you kind of liked when you didn't know. And that's what fallen means. They have left the place of trust. They've left the place of relationship. We will see that especially tomorrow. But there is now a wedge, relational wedge. It's hinted at between them, and tomorrow I think we see it more clearly between the humans and their creator.
Yeah, right. And, you know, let's make no mistake about it that we are tempted to believe that being able to discern between good and evil is generally a positive thing. In fact, that's a thing that we strive to teach our kids and remind ourselves of. That's not what's in play here, because fundamentally Adam and Eve, they didn't need to discern between good and evil. They lived in a garden that was created and ordered so that they might be safe and flourish. There's been all of this positive commandment thus far in the creation story to grow, to expand, to enjoy this place, right? There's been no need for God to illuminate their eyes to reveal to them the right and the wrong. That there's no need for the kind of moral jiggering that is now going to be a part of Adam and Eve's life from this point forward. They've made the decision to themselves become those tinkering with right and wrong, with moral. That they didn't need to. That was not what they were intended to do as the creation, but yet that is what they aspired to take. And in doing so, they now bear the weight of it. And this is, I mean, not to make this overly simplistic, Clint, but when we reach for privilege in our own lives, it always comes with a form of responsibility. And lots of times we don't like the responsibility that comes with it. That's a reality of life. And they've done that in the ultimate cosmic sense in this story.
Be very careful not to insert the word about. In other words, we're maybe tempted to think, well, they knew about good and they knew about evil. Pre this decision, they only knew good. They knew the fruit of the garden. They knew the safety of the garden. They knew the relationship with the Creator. They didn't know evil. They hadn't done evil. They hadn't disobeyed. This is not information they have learned. This is hindrance. This is mistake. They've now learned through disobedience. They now know evil, not know about evil. They now know evil. They've practiced it. They've fallen into temptation and disobeyed their Creator, and they now know, as previously they only knew good, now they know both sides of the fence, and consequently, there will no longer be a place for them in the place that is only made for good.
Yeah, that's really the danger, isn't it, in making this story about some people stealing some fruit, like some people going and stealing a ho-ho, right? Like you say, man, it seems like a disproportionate outcome to the crime that's committed. But when you really slow down to read the story and you try to separate from all of that classic imagery of the apple on the tree, and that apple, by the way, has shown up in all of these different places. I even think of like Snow White. You have this apple that's this tempting thing, right? It's built into sort of even our cultural imagination. It's not about the apple. It's about what it reveals to us about the human inclination. It reveals to us the extent to which we're willing to go to literally take from God's tree the thing that God said is the only thing that we should avoid, right? For God to say, I've created a world of abundance. This is what I want for you. And then us to see that abundance and say, but I will only be content if I get this thing, God. And then we make this demand of God as the creator. Friends, this isn't some small little mistake on a Wednesday afternoon. This is the revelation, unfortunately in a very negative direction, of the extent to which we as humans are willing to try to grasp at the power, authority, and the intention of the one who made us. And to whatever extent we all know that is within us, we participate in the same temptation that Adam and Eve gave into.
Yeah, when you've seen this story on a felt board or narrated in a children's Bible, it's perhaps loses some of its edge. But anything you want to substitute for eating the fruit, the most heinous of acts, the most callous of hearts, whatever it is that human disobedience has led to since the garden, is inherent in the taking of this fruit. That is the idea of the. And again, pay attention next week when we see how quickly this act moves, how quickly it grows into full-born, full-fledged, full-bore sin. And I think it's clear to see that this is the depth of what the story means in this disobedient act.
Isn't it interesting, Clint, with how much time in art and in sermons and in Sunday school classes we've given to this text, how little is actually here? A lot of this, as you led this afternoon, a lot of this is a product of our imagination as opposed to what's actually in the scriptures. What we actually have here are sparse words, which I think really are an invitation for us to see this not as sort of a cosmic film set, but rather as an opportunity for us to see this as a reflection of ourselves. I mean, we can so easily put ourselves in these characters. That is not on accident. And, I think that's a really helpful preconception to come to this story with, because that is where we learn a lesson as opposed to just seeing a thing play out that we wish hadn't.
To some extent, this is true of all of Genesis, but I think particularly in the first 2 chapters, we are given many opportunities to miss the point. There are lots of rabbit trails to follow. Why is it a fruit? What kind of fruit is it? These are the questions that have occupied people's mind. And it's not that they're not interesting. It's that generally they're not particularly helpful because they detract from and distract us from the main point, which is God created us to be one way, and through disobedience, we became another way. And it again, we can play around with some of those questions. Some of it is even fun, but you have to be very careful thinking this is a story about what kind of fruit you should or shouldn't eat. That's not it at all.
Well said. Good summary. Thanks for being with us, friends. We will see you tomorrow.